Okay, good. So, hello. Welcome
Hello to
to
everyone.
you, Martin. Yeah, so I'm here, same place, same day. Well, not the same day, but it feels like the same day because you can't tell one day from the next. Currently, still here in Newport, and Martin, you're there in Sofia.
Yeah, same place. My end too.
Our regular connection on a Saturday is here. So let's see what comes up in today's conversation. Yeah. So we were just chatting before we started recording about movement and travel and the opening up of the possibility of moving across, well, moving within borders to begin with, and then across borders. And obviously that is subject to all kinds of strange changes and machinations and restrictions and goodness knows what. But yeah, I guess there are some signs that that the full lockdown, which had been prevailing, is beginning to soften in some places or prepare to soften in other places. Yeah, I just wondered, in general terms, what that feels like from your end.
The first thing that comes to mind is confusing, really. So the the confusing thing is that, as we mentioned before recording it, I have this strange feeling of people being split up in this subject, as well as other subjects that we've discussed and touched upon in the previous episode. From the point of view that how I see it, some people stick to the lockdown measures, wearing masks, really being cautious, washing their hands, using sanitizer, and all sorts of things that we're already familiar with. Some people are really fed up with all of that, sticking to the measures, but since yesterday afternoon, masks are no longer obligatory except for entering markets and shops. No one felt that because people already stopped. Well, the majority of people already stopped wearing masks. So people are announcing something on the TV that, in a parallel universe, you would suppose this is a very cheerful, point in time that people will just get, infected with joy and will say, "Ooh, our mask!" They will tear them up. It's like the fall of the Berlin Wall or anything like that. But no, that this just slide into reality very, very smoothly. And a friend of mine just told me, we are not really obligated to wear masks. And I was like, I don't have any. So there was this thing going.
Yes.
So people sticking to the plan of lockdown and people being fed up with the plan of lockdown and not really sticking to it, just ditching masks, ditching the sanitizer. So I'm not sure how to make sense of that, but two groups of people mainly. Of course, there are people that I find this more and more, and it's really interesting. Some people say, I don't care.
Okay.
I'm not seeing how that's the case. I'm not seeing how that's possible even. Even if we stick extremely, firmly to ego psychology or anything, the ego has the, the power to not really care about that. But I'm not seeing from neuropsychological perspective, there's all sorts of scanners, locked in this box here that's holding up the brain that really scan reality. And there are things that are treated as threats.
Yes.
Even the smallest changes in the room, this the Russian scientist that described the orientation reflex. Sokolov, I think this was his name. He was a student of Luria's, and he said, well, any change in immediate reality of any sort, even if the microwave rings, it's finished cooking, even this is treated by the neural circuits scanning the reality as threat because it's an immediate change of reality, and I'm immediately oriented towards it just to see what's going on, if it will kill me, if it will feed me, if it love me, hate me, or anything. So I'm not really believing that people saying I don't care really don't care.
Yes. No, I see what you mean. That's a very interesting thing, isn't it? That anything that enters our awareness initially as a threat,
Yeah.
or as a sort of quarantine. Like, I don't know what this is yet, and until I decide what it is, which is mostly automated pattern recognition stuff rather than direct, every time the microwave rings I have to work out that it's the microwave ringing. I've just got a shortcut to that ping noise means this. But if it's slightly louder than usual or slightly different pitch than usual, I'm immediately going to be aware of that.
Yeah.
Reminds me of, well, I think we talked about it in our first time we did this, the scientists who had rendered the coronavirus as music. So they'd assigned musical and rhythmic and notational value to it, and then in order to track mutations and changes, because we could hear them quicker than we could detect them through other forms of analysis. That something being slightly off key or slightly quicker or slightly different pitch is going to be more apparent more quickly. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting one. I agree. I think as well here, there's a similar people falling into various camps or polarities around this. And also there's my week and my working week, I think some of the things I take away from that is that the novelty has long since worn off for people. The image came to me this morning of, it's like having worn the same pair of socks for a long time, and now there's a hole appearing where the heel of the sock would be, and it's like, okay, do I go barefoot? Do I take them off and mend them? What is it important that the hole happens? Something is wearing thin here about the experience of lockdown, and of course, political response to that is here anyway in Britain is to start talking about the next phase, but not actually introducing it, to sort of tantalize. And I guess these are all sort of social readjustment things as well. There's even an argument here now that, oh no, our lockdown has been too successful. The message got through too strongly, and people are now, the message having been stay at home, save lives. That's how they said it here. And you're not stuck at home. They said you're safe at home. It's like a reframing exercise. So now people are like, well, I'm safe at home, so I'm not leaving home. No, you can come out now. It's safe at home. So there's how do you inoculate against that and reintroduce, the uncertainty? And of course, then there are other people, as you were describing, for whom it's let me out of here immediately. I can't take another day of being confined in this. Yeah. Personally, the sense of the weather having changed, we went from a glorious 3 weeks of very unlikely sunshine and early spring, glorious, almost summer day-like weather, to regular British spring weather for the last week of April, which has been a bit chilly, except when the sun comes out, lots of very heavy showers and rain, quite dull. And it's a different business. The animal, creaturely part of us, can't sit in the sun to offset some of the stress it might be carrying, or the unprocessed anxiety it's picked up from somewhere else. So that's definitely been a factor, very interestingly.
But that's even, it's adding to the train of thought here. There's anxiety picked up from elsewhere, not necessarily from the lockdown situation, not necessarily from being frightened of being, contracting or being with the coronavirus already.
Absolutely. Rather like your research early on in this whole process started to indicate, even at that point, very, very early, that people's greatest fear wasn't of the virus. I think, without preempting your research, I think the sort of anecdotal take on that from this end is that people are increasingly anxious or concerned about the the mitigation of the virus. So the virus is just the virus, and it's entered into some. We're not in pre-pandemic thinking anymore. Let's say people have adjusted deeply to pandemic thinking, perhaps problematically. So, and their anxieties are now about some of the stuff we touched on last time about the potentials for tyranny or the potentials for authoritarianism to exploit certain dispositions in the social organism in the name of safety, in the name of public health, medical martial law, as I heard it described this last week or so. I mean, I don't buy that as the reality. I think it's an interesting phrase to conjure with. Yeah, and I suppose it one way of framing it as a polarity, as a dialectic, which has all sorts of problems, but is maybe a starting point, is the way it's framed as: do we save lives or do we save livelihoods? Do we protect people from the virus by having them locked down at home and not spreading, crushing the curve, all of that? Or do we let them out so they can engage in their meaningful activity and their obviously economic activity? Because if we don't, when we eventually emerge, there won't be anything. All the businesses will have closed or died. And I mean, I think there is a compelling argument that that's much more ominous for health. Apart from anything else, there's no tax revenues to pay for any of it. But equally, people's well-being will plummet if the things that they rely on for their life aren't available. So it's a delicate balancing act, and I think probably a false dialectic ultimately to frame it that way, as protect lives or protect livelihoods. I don't think it is. In classic psychosynthesis terms, it's not an either-or choice. We clearly need to do both.
Just got reminded of something. While you were talking, I always imagine, this Hegelian approach of the synthesis with the triangle that's often used in psychosynthesis terms, of really tracking down how the value is not dissolved, but you have both poles, conserved as well, and there's a third thing being born and so on. But I got this thing without really thinking about it as a reaction to what you were saying, that there's the inbuilt recognition of the tribal principle that we all carry. Because if I have to be honest, I've reflected on that years ago, even traveling mainly to London, because this is a place where I work, and seeing thousands of people, this people grinder of a city, everything was crazy, and I was always reminded that the tribal principle that we have built our inner architecture is to bear in mind two people at a time, directly, and to have the livelihood, the brotherhood even, of 120 people in one tribe. Everything that exceeds that is no longer trackable. So, this is a very bold, idea from my end, but I do suppose that we will probably have to begin with being in tribes again.
Yes.
Just to be able to position ourselves outside of home, but outside of massive gatherings of thousands of people, because both of them will probably be not that beneficial as before.
Yes. Yeah, but there's lots there, isn't there? The sense of, people have described the so-called social bubble kind of version of these affairs. So you have 10 people or something that you each allow for one another's purity, one might say. You trust one another's isolation has resulted in no infection, and therefore you start to open up and mix with that group of people, trusting that their hygiene extends in each direction. And I know in Italy, I think was it just in the last day or two, in the slight opening up of the conditions there, one of the definitions in the law that enabled that shift, I think, defines, or doesn't define, leaves very vague and very archaic, this definition of kin, that you can mix with your kin. And there's this whole debate around, well, who's my kin? You know, does it include friends? Does it include
Yeah.
where does it stop? Is it great aunties, or is it just the more immediate sense? And a lot of it's been thrown back on the individual, as I understand it, the sense of, well, you know, you have to be sensible about it, and you have to don't have a great big family dinner was one of the pieces of advice. So yeah, the way we're using words is very interesting. And it's really interesting that in a legal document you'd go back to an archaic term as if it's speaking to a deeper layer of the population, not the hyper modern postmodern, yeah, fragmented meme generating, you know, part, but something that knows what's being referred to in some way, or knows where its boundaries are, which is a bit more like your tribal description there. Yeah, that's, I think almost inevitably that's a phased return, isn't it? That's a place one has to come through. One of the other things that might relate to that, that's sort of occupied a bit of my thinking in the last few days, and I'm aware this could be, you know, not to everyone's taste as a way of saying it. I'm basically talking about it symbolically and in terms of kind of transpersonal symbolism, really, the pattern within the collective, but also there's a kind of astrological dimension to this as well. And it comes to a tension. So the astrological bit would be the square being made in the sky between Saturn and Pluto, which archetypally starts to describe a tension between the urge to deepen and individuate in Jungian terms, or confront that which is one's true essence and depth, in tension with limits and structures and forms and time and space, which in very shorthand way of saying it is the world of the father. That would be the kind of archetypal prescriptive way of saying it. So in very shorthand way, one element of what we're speaking about here and what we're facing as a collective could be called a father crisis. You know, where is father telling us what to do or what not to do, and where are we in relation to that as tiny children, or, you know, grown adults, or internalizing that, or being that father figure ourselves, manifesting it within our tribe, or defying it, having a kind of oppositional relationship to it. It seems like there's a lot of that there. I mean, in Britain, it has gone something like lots of squabbling and then action on the part of kind of state or governmental father, lockdown, resulting in that's not enough. We should be locked down further. So it's like, Dad, you're not being hard enough on us. And then another kind of questioning, which is, Dad, you're repressing us. You're being too hard on us. Push it away. And as soon as you say it in that way, it's a more approachable thing. It's less abstracted, I think, and more living, more in the realm of our experience. But yeah, we've long had a problem with father, it seems to me, in our culture, literally and metaphysically, and probably in many other ways.
I agree with that immediately.
And some of the care response of the crisis. You know, I was talking to someone the other day who was saying, why are we even doing any of this? You know, the numbers that are infected and die are tiny when compared to other diseases, and we don't do that for them. Why are we doing it for this? And there's a point to be made in there, certainly. I mean, some of those diseases don't have the same transmission profile. There's all sorts of complexity in there, but it's a reasonable thing to observe. And my answer was something like, well, because we saw it. So once we've seen it, we are obliged, because we consider ourselves a civilization, we are obliged to act according to that information, that knowledge. So it's basically, I found myself speaking in sort of Christian terms of mercy, really. It's like, this is the merciful thing to do. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's unproblematic. It doesn't mean it's the only choice. but it's the civilized choice according to the mores of this particular civilization. And we may discover that our actions made mercifully, in other words, to lock down and protect the vulnerable, rather than the guy in the States sacrifice the weak. Our action of doing that might, it's entirely possible, might cause more harm than good, that we enter into the law of unintended consequences. But that doesn't change the fact that it came from an intention to be merciful. It simply it makes us encounter our limits again. It's another, there'd be a missing father component to that, which would just say, it'd get very sticky, and that kind of all-encompassing maternal. I've got a pink shirt on, but I always used to see it visually as a pink kind of blancmange-like energy of only good things should ever happen to anyone and no one should ever suffer, which is obviously an ideal rather than a possibility within this samsaric reality that we inhabit. So yeah, that's a very kind of rambling way of sketching out certain fear dynamics in relation to that, certain aspirations that aren't met in regard to that, because part of the failure of the father archetype in our time, to me, seems to be a failure of leadership. We just don't have politicians, whether they're men or women. I'm not talking gendered here, just energetically. There's very few who would qualify as leading in a way that seems to be full spectrum of that father empowerment. And a final thought, and then I'll shut up. It also reminds me of, so for years and years I used to work a lot, and it was very, very instructive and helpful, and it comes back to me in times like this. I used to work with a colleague who's a drama therapist, and we worked a lot. We worked in prisons, we worked in schools, we worked in sort of general public, working with myth and story and all that. It was really, really compelling and deep. And one of the things I remember that I learned from her early on was in the kind of grammar of movement, as it's sometimes called, that is to do with a language of gesture and body and embodiment. As drama therapists don't tend to work that heavily with words. The archetypal physical expression of mother was, if I sit so you can see it, was like this. It's a kind of creating a space with the arms that has this gate here. So there's this idealized safe place in here that a child could grow, or that someone could heal. And there's also a gateway here where people can come and go. So too loose a mothering is like this, there's no safety, too exposed, and too restrictive is like this, there's no gate, I can't get out, I'm trapped, I'm being consumed. All those kind of infantile woundings of being consumed by the all-powerful mother and so forth. And that felt very clear, very relatable, showed up again and again and again in actual work with actual people. And then you switch to, well, okay, that's mother. What's the father archetype? What's the equivalent form, embodied and held and maybe dynamic for father? And it's entirely different and much more difficult in a way to have traction upon. So you have to imagine that you as the one enacting the movement, you're in the father role, and before you is the child, who is, the height of, say, a 3 or 4 year old child. So sort of coming up to your thigh or something. And you're behind them and you're doing this. You're reaching down and you're lifting them up. You're holding them maybe in the middle of their body, under their arms, around their hips, and lifting them up until their eyes are kind of the same height as your eyes. So they're suddenly temporarily elevated to adult height. And you're sort of doing that. You're sort of making this gesture like this, that it didn't have words, but it, in my mind, always had this sense of, you see that child, my son, my daughter, whoever you are, the little one that I'm responsible for, you see all that out there. That's the world. That's where you're going. When you're bigger, when you've grown, that's where you'll live your life, out there in that world, and it'll be a good place to be. It's a safe place to go. It'll be, there's things you'll need to learn. It'll be perilous at times, but it'll be out there, and this is your first proper glimpse of it, your elevated chance to see what you can't see from a child's height, and then you have to put them back down. So it's a much more mysterious proposition, it seems to me, at least in this time and place, to try, or it has been for me, to try and come to some understanding of. And whatever that is at the level of the collective and the culture, and you could say the civilization, seems to be part of what's sick, part of what has been ailing, and maybe part of what's involved in us reckoning with this whole corona and post-corona crisis.
Fingers crossed, what I'm going to say rings a bell for the people watching that. While referring to that, just lifting the kitten, and that's a very fatherly thing to go for. When you're in this state of I won't really be the one carrying the boundaries for you. I'm going to soften up a bit. I will be joyful and playful with you right now. But what this reminded me immediately was there's a scene in Lion King where Mufasa is telling to Simba, "Come here." I suppose because Rafiki is the only one who is able to lift Simba, because lions cannot do that. So that's probably a reference to that. But they're standing on the same rock that Rafiki lifted Simba to introduce him to the world. And so Mufasa, the father exclamation mark in this movie, is really introducing his afraid and confused son that really thinks he has the thing going to be fit for a king, but he's saying, all of this one day will be yours. And then Simba is asking for the shadowy place, stuck somewhere deep into the woods behind them, and then so on. He's asking, what's that? The shadowy thing, and he's saying, well, that's not a thing that you will reach. It's out of your reach, probably. And to just further my thought, and I just got reminded that Lion King is the only, maybe it was first designed as a play, as a theater play. The reason behind that, one of the reasons behind that, is that it's the only Disney movie that's not original as a structure. It's a copy-paste of Hamlet. It's changed names. The structure of the action of the first movie, I'm not sure about the next movies, of course. I haven't watched them even. But the first movie is really Hamlet. And there's a lot going on with the shadow archetype and with the father archetype in Hamlet. I'm not sure about the Lion King. I haven't met anything there. But in Hamlet, there's a lot going on, but I've stumbled upon some kind of analysis of that, people really thinking about it. I've tried to do it myself, but it's really hard for me, and I'm not sure why, but it's really cluttering my reflection. And it might be a personal thing, might be just because it's a too dense and heavy of a artistic expression. Hamlet has a structure and people there. But I'm trying to remember, not really sure who was carrying the fatherly archetype in Hamlet. If there's one person.
Yeah, it's conflicted, isn't it? Because you've got the murdered king and his ghost, who certainly literally carries some of father, and the revenge motif. Avenge your father is basically the setup of the thing, isn't it? And then I guess you've got the usurper, the one who is now in the position of father or stepfather, but is flawed and murderous. And then you've got Hamlet's what problematic, stuck, arrested development, existential crisis, to be or not to be, literally. Part of which is, could I imagine myself living into father. I mean, it's a very contemporary kind of dilemma. Clearly is. Yeah.
In your father's shoes, even if it, as a contemporary, will use an expression, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. And it conjures everything else, doesn't it? It questions the nature of reality as a result of questioning the nature of father. That seems to follow, both with the kind of kingship, the crowning. Well, I guess we're talking the relationship of self to ego at some level here as well, and that which enters the stream of time and undergoes the processes of change and development and growth, and that which remains above the fray, you could say, as a principle or an encrowned. We're back to Corona, the coronation, the one that wears the crown, which explicitly a Christian image in that tradition. Yeah. I was reading recently about the origins of crowning in the English royal lineage tradition, which goes back to a particular Anglo-Saxon king who was the first one to wear a coronet crown. Before that, you'd have a sword, or you'd have some other status that guaranteed your overlordship and your office. But yeah, explicitly, the crown of thorns, the coronation, the mimicking of a bishop's enthronement as well, to receive the chrism oil, the sacred anointing blessing oil that goes back to Christ and the risen Christ. So it's a powerful image, and fatherhood is wrapped in that, both at the individual level of the psyche, but clearly when we're talking about collectives, absolutely so. Yeah.
But even from there's the social media, the people referring to this will probably sound judgmental at one point, but
yeah,
even so, I still think this is the case, that people oftentimes refer in social media and on TV to deeply philosophical, deeply soulful texts throughout the history, but they surgically, very precisely, cut out a portion that suits the needs right now, take it out of context, use it. The thing I'm seeing right now, very widespread, is Nietzsche's God is dead. But that's it,
Yeah.
God is dead, that's fine. No context there. If anyone goes on to read the full text,
yes,
it's connected with hundreds and probably thousands of things that you can mold together back, and see what was meant there. And this is not the thing that God is dead by himself or whatever, but that the belief and the internal God that we probably connect with or project inward or outwardly, I'm not sure how, this thing is decaying, within us because of other values around it that probably pressured it or betrayed it or so on. And right now with this fatherly figure, if we can use the childish image of a grandfather in the sky, I'm seeing more and more how people say God is dead, not because God is dead, but because they're angry at him, as if this grandfather in the sky went on a vacation and abandoned the people on Earth. And right now they're all angry and they're saying, well, we'll just do it ourselves. Fuck you up in the sky. Sorry for swearing. And this collective feeling of being abandoned creates not all the ruckus, but all the reaction we see from let's inject ourselves with bleach, or no, you eat 12 coconuts a day and you have to scrape your face with the rest. It's stuff like that, crazy things.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great link as well, a segue into, I mean, so much of this and the analysis of this requires Nietzsche, doesn't it? And the kind of post-Nietzschean rift, the Nietzsche probably better than anyone inserted some some steel part of himself into some fault line in the culture and then ripped it over time apart. And yeah, that strap line, it's almost a t-shirt slogan, isn't it now? God is dead. That misrepresents the entire affair, it seems to me. And it's a sort of excuse to stop thinking rather than anything Nietzsche would have meant by it, which was that puts all the responsibility on you. It's not an excuse to just like rage at a big hole. But however we come at it, we end up functionally in this place where the space previously occupied by the Judeo-Christian God, you could say, culturally speaking, because that space is still filled for many people, but for the majority it isn't. We're post-Christian world, certainly continent in terms of Europe anyway, and that hasn't gone well for us, frankly. I mean, you could almost extend it, as John Ralston Saul does, to the project of the French philosophes, the age of reason, the Enlightenment, this project to lead to what Nietzsche eventually announces as the death of God. And it is almost childlike. The kind of, there's an earthquake in Lisbon in the 1780s. It gets reported on very quickly because of the communication technologies having improved. Suddenly people are reading within weeks of this devastating event, and they're starting to blame God. How could God allow this to happen? Which is a refrain you hear all the time in the modern era. How did God allow Auschwitz? How did God allow, if there's a God, why would he let this poor child suffer with this terrible rare cancer or whatever it is? And it's totally understandable, and one wouldn't wish to visit judgment upon it. But it's also an incredibly naive position from which to try and build a civilization. And we're left with a kind of, well, what have we got? We've got a previously Christian civilization, by and large, in the European sense, and all of its edifices and structures and institutions, and no Christian practice, really speaking. So nothing that renews or feeds or waters at the bottom any of those structures. So they're slowly ossifying and mouldering even. And people stop believing in them, even though their urge towards them is very strong. And then you have this hole, the deus absconditus, the hole that was previously occupied by the divine, which I think, the way I think of it these days, it's like we've created a software patch for it, and we call that science, and we plug it in, and it appears to work, but it wasn't built for that. Science is not a replacement for God. And you see in the history of science, as you do in the history of other things too, that many of the preeminent scientists had reconciled often their Christian faith, but sometimes other belief systems to their science, because science is a mode of inquiry and a way of knowing and a way of keeping asking questions that penetrate and move the thing forward. It's not a structure of belief. And yet, I suppose this current crisis, to bring us back there, we see all of that enacted. So again, the British example is, well, the government has said all along, we're following the science, which is another way of saying God told us to do this. We're acting as God's regents on earth, following the science. Okay, but our scientists are saying something different than your scientists. So whose scientists really have the answer? And of course, it's just medieval in formulating it that way. We'll soon be asking, how many angels dance on the head of a pin, or how many vaccines can be installed in the upgrade. So there is a mistaken premise, perhaps, somewhere in all of this, that I'm not meaning in any way to denigrate science, but what some have called scientism is deeply problematic, because it's probably very strong in the population at large that science has the answer to life, the universe, and everything, to quote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah.
But this idea of I love the example of the software patch. Even more so, the patch has to be updated, as it is with scientific and media and tech communities every month.
Yes.
You need to have
because the virus will get in otherwise.
Something will probably penetrate and will ruin things and stuff. A virus itself.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm always trying to make sense of something else that's directly connected to that. Science, it has a very realistic manifestation. I can probably stick a needle in my arm and then take some drops of blood, and then there's a microscope. If I zoom 4,000 times, I will probably see blood cells, and I can describe that.
Yeah.
And the scientific principle, I believe, still is, if that gets repeated 3 times, not really exactly, because you cannot replicate the circumstances exactly, but if it gets replicated 3 times, this is considered like an axiom or a theorem of some sort. But that's just a very convincing and beautiful illusion that just has a life of its own. It's built to convince you that it's real. And that's a very magical thinking kind of sort. The religious component of I will lick the coffin of someone and it will save me from the virus, and I'm licking that, and it's proving wrong. Science has this certain region of operations, of neural firings even inside its own nervous system. That's really there to convince you.
Yes.
I must say it's very convincing.
Yes. Oh yes. Yeah.
Me personally, I was having issues with my smartphone these days. There was a software patch, quite literally, that arrived, and it ruined my battery life. So I'm from a full day of battery life to 3, 4, 5 hours, something like that. But the curious thing here is what kind of thinking got me in connection to the phone directly. I was really going with, is there anyone that's planning on doing this software update to ruin my phone so I can buy the next best model? And this is very convincing to a certain...
Well, and we know that this has many precedents. This happens. This is in the interests of people who sell phones.
But another thing that got me thinking and really feeling frustrated around it is, why did I allow this software patch? Why did I press download and install and it got into the system? Something else was my partner's phone, brand new, very cheap, but very, very cool. And mine was, I was really planning on buying something for a little bit more money to reassure myself that I will have it for a longer time. This is very metaphorically speaking to the situation. And I was looking at her phone and she's really clicking on it all day. We're locked in at home, and she's like, and I'm like, I envy you so much right now, for your battery life, that you haven't installed your software patch. I'm really trying to transfer all of this thinking and feeling to how belief, religion, science, magical thinking, how's the connection going between them? Why did we allow to have science in the first place? And right now that we have science already, why are we not allowing belief, values, and religious spiritual experiences to re-enter the scene?
Yes. Yeah, that's a deeply important question. One to return to, I think, in these conversations. It'll come up again and again. It also, several other things came up then as you were speaking. So the thinking, or the line of thinking that has it that the increase in complexity of technology in rapid order is an expression, a manifestation of what many people seem to call the religion of progress. So in order to continue the progress, it has to keep selling you a new phone, a new model of this, a new upgrade for that, a new patch. But actually, from another point of view, there's very little progress, because all the major inventions upon which we still base our civilization and our material expression of it are basically 20th century or even earlier inventions, like the car, which is a late 19th century invention, very, very early 20th century perfection for different engine types, or the aeroplane, or mobile technologies and so forth. So there's a sort of marketing trick going on somewhere in all of this too. And there's a view that suggests that the coming together, the interconnectedness of what some would call the technosphere in opposition to the biosphere, sees the technosphere manifest its own kind of awareness that is, again, a sort of almost Hegelian dialectic with the biosphere's clear awareness and consciousness. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. I don't personally buy into it, but I think it gives rise to some interesting analyses, like from the point of view of that technosphere view, that's what this coronavirus crisis is. There has to be a crisis, because we have to pause the system to upgrade it. And we're not interested in life per se, because that's the biosphere's job, and we're not interested in that. We're interested in converting the biosphere into the technosphere more and more effectively. So how do we do that? Well, we have to have more control, more authoritarian patches and controls and dynamics. How do you do that? Well, you have to sell people hell. You have to sell them the apocalypse. You have to scare the living daylights out of them, basically. Which reminds me of the stories that repeat over and over again of first contacts and conversions of indigenous populations to prevailing empires, you could say. So, lots of the recent examples would be the Christian different aspects of that, be it the English-speaking one, the Spanish-speaking one, and so forth. But how do you convert native peoples, as it were, in their own place, intact with their own tradition, to your very alien monotheistic religion? Because they don't want it, they won't buy it, they don't need it. There's no way of comprehending it from their point of view. They will welcome your God alongside theirs, most likely, and invite it to the table and lay a meal for it and honor it, but they won't throw their gods away to be with yours until you sell them hell. You have to take them to hell first, and then sell them your religion as the antidote to that hell, and then you have them. And it's almost like a technological upskilling of that same impulse. That's where the action is perceived from that point of view. Now, my problem with that is that it sails very close to the wind of conspiracy theory, which is extremely close to the dilemma we were sketching earlier about the father. So in the absence of the father, we will create a bad father, or we will encounter a negative father, a Darth Vader, or a kind of projected dark one. In inner one as well, of course. All of these are inner dynamics as much as they're enacted outwardly. But the problem with conspiracy theory, as I experience it, and I certainly read my fair share of the weirder ends of these things over time. They're incredibly creative. They have a true element to them, I would suggest, which is often to do with the desire to know, to penetrate the veil and to see what's really going on. All of which is entirely within the realm of adult human beings, and you could say the spiritual path. It's driven by the desire to seek deeper and truer awareness and knowledge and wisdom, and to perceive things more clearly. The problem with conspiracy theories is they cannot accept limit, so they become totalities very quickly. They want to explain everything that ever was according to a particular angle. So it can be very creative, But when you really perceive them and look at what they're serving, the answer is invariably fear. They are compost for the fearful reflexes in a population. In other words, they guarantee my victimhood. They mean that I can, protest in ever more marginal and obscured and yet, sort of romantically viable ways that I'm being oppressed, that I'm a victim. And therefore, like anything that reeks that much of victim, it is, how to say it, it's kind of abhorrent to the more fulfilled part of the psyche, and to the what some teachers would call the spiritual masculine. Spiritual masculine cannot be in the presence of victimhood. Put it that way. It just won't have it, because they can't coexist in the same space. It's like matter and antimatter. And conspiracy theories fall apart at that point because they don't stand as themselves, as their ground, as their... They remain trapped within the dialectic. They never transcend. They never find that kind of integrating, rising point, that energetic lift of... what does Ken Wilber call it? Transcend and include. Their interest is in staying in the oppression of the dialectic and on the receiving end of the bad treatment, going, they're the bad guys and we're pure, we're the Rebel Alliance, or we're the... And none of which is to say much about their content, because that varies. Some of it, to me, appears to be psychotic and insane, and some of it appears to be very compelling and have good grounds. But yeah, speaking generally about it, it falls into the father trap, I think, something like that.
Well, I do believe that this aligns well with, if we treat the widespread, the mainstream theories about the virus.
Yes.
There are two. I know there's a lot of research on how many conspiracy theories there are, and it's not that many. It's around 20, 25, 30 conspiracy theories all around the world, because there's not that much room left for any creativity.
In the niche, the ecological niche for conspiracy.
But I do think that there are two main conspiracy theories, or theories in general. One is that the virus is some sort of a bioweapon, and the other one is that the other one diminishes the severity of the virus. So it's those two, and just from the very fatherly engagement with all of that, I can imagine there's the two possibilities, which are a matter of choice, either conscious or unconscious. And then we have to choose one of them. But in order to be sure that we've chosen the right one, we need the father figure, the godly figure, the presence to turn to and say, is this one right? Did I choose right? And then there's someone there are many options here to slap us and to say, no, like the bad father manifest of the archetype. No, you haven't chosen the right one, so something like that. Or the caring father that, patting you on the head saying, well, this is not the best one, but you can go back and see how it is. The other one might have some value within it. Choose wisely. There's which psychoanalysis is really engaged with the absent father, which will just say, well, choose whatever. I really don't care. And so there's a lot of dynamic in my view that this is manifesting, from the big one, from the transcendent position of the archetype of God. And then it gets dissolved and really split into so many scenarios, scripts, or variations that each and every one of us has to face, at least several of them. And this is probably a very referring to Ken Wilber again, last time we touched upon the post-rational, the rational, and the pre-rational structures of the mind. And only the pre-rational is not suffering in this kind of situation. If you're rational or post-rational, you will probably experience more than one or two of these scenarios, and you will have to choose not only in terms of the virus theories, but in terms of the conceptualizations of the choice of the coronavirus conspiracy theories.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think as well of what I was saying before about this sort of Technosphere software patch thing to do with the absence of God in the collective perception, post-Nietzschean, misunderstood, and all of that. And I was talking about what people call the religion of progress, and you can trace that pretty accurately. And you can also trace people. It's a law of diminishing returns, isn't it? People are less and less convinced by it, because everyone knows that the phone in your pocket is some dazzling piece of kit, but you also know it to be a source of enormous frustration and irritation and anguish and damn thing, because we're much more impressed by when it doesn't work than when it does work, or when the internet fails, or when but also because we're not living on the moon and we're not driving around in space cars nipping off to Uranus for an afternoon's shopping, are we? That dream of the post-Second World War kind of upsurge of the fossil fuels industry and things as well just has not come to pass. And really, I don't know anyone that believes that it is going to. It's clearly in the realm of sci-fi and fiction, and you get your kind of Bond villain characters like Elon Musk who still bang on about it because they're useful to that sphere. Not because it's destiny, manifest destiny. It's simply the same story repeated. So that reminded me of something I've heard Stephen Jenkinson say, which I've always found to be deeply penetratingly true. And he says the real religion of the West, meaning the globalized world, really, that is made in the image of North American, Western, English-speaking, kind of hyper-capital kind of way of being and organizing things. The real religion of the West, he says, it's not Christianity, it's not progress. The real religion of the West is inanimism. It's the fact that everything is already dead and maybe never was alive, and therefore a resource that I can co-opt and exploit and basically see a dollar value in. I can cash in, I can look at the tree and see it as a profit. Or I can look at the person and see them as a resource to be exploited in some way, and all human relations and everything else that goes with it, including our interior. That we, many years ago, I found myself using this phrase, and I kind of stuck with it. It's like we get to a point where we end up fracking our own psyche, trying to exploit more juice from it, more payoff, more reason to get out of bed in the morning, more impetus to do this thing, but minus the connection to what is really a transpersonal awareness of Thich Nhat Hanh calls it interbeing, the kind of lived knowledge and awareness of our interconnectedness with all other forms of life, which are all other forms, in effect, because everything is alive. So there's that's the counterspell, I suppose, to the religion of inanimism, is rather than to see everything as dead matter, including myself, or everything but myself, if we're narcissistic enough. We instead we see everything, or we grant everything its being. You could say it that way around. So, the screen I'm looking at, on which your image is appearing to me, is alive, as are you, as are the eyes that I'm looking through it at. They're all participating in some sort of spontaneous arising of consciousness, so that the gap is closed rather than insisted upon. So that I find to be a useful source of or a kind of well to go to and draw water from.
Just 2 weeks ago, I just got reminded that from the end of the clinic I'm working in, we decided to do online groups in Zoom with as many people as they are subscribed to that, to share professional experience, completely out of the idea that even the health workers, the mental health workers, the psychological social workers need their space, because every person is stuck at home reflecting on something, reading stuff.
Yeah.
And I suppose this is like a magical or wishful thinking to be together again, through that. And I was as passive as possibly, because I could feel the anxiety within myself. So if I wasn't that passive, I would have just occupied the space for the 20 people that were in the Zoom meeting. So I was just mentioning stuff.
Yeah.
How about that? No active exploration of anything. And people themselves, nurses, social workers, people of any sort, lawyers even, they reached a point where there was the idea that online working was dead compared to the offline working in the therapy room, or in the clinics or hospitals. And there was something inanimate around that. And I find it very difficult to believe, to stick to the idea that even now that that this is an ongoing thing, and the connection is really good in terms of internet and personal. I can see you on the screen of my computer, and probably people watching that can see me and you on the screen of their computers.
Yes.
But how are you to reassure yourself these are real people?
Yes. Yes.
Where's the scientific explanation?
Yes. No, it's a great point, isn't it? And I mean, this is for another time, because I know we're on the home straight here. But I think relevant to that is the some people talk about the extinction of the text as the cultural basis. So having been a civilization of the word, in both the word made flesh Christian sense, but also pre that, just we're a literate culture, we're a written textual culture, that we are arguably shifting into something that I guess is a visual culture, that our media are pushing us, and the screens in particular, to not be fluent in the word and not really read. And I mean, homeschooling just during the lockdown has been an interesting take on that. I mean, one of my son's first assignments was to write a response to a poem and then write his own poem. But for some reason that I cannot fathom and still makes me feel nauseous, he had to write his poem in emojis. Like, what? Why would you require that? What is going on there? What is that doing in the lesson plan? Bizarre. But that's a silly example. But that type of direction, where less textual, we're less readers, at least in the reading of a word, and more readers of visual fields or visual kind of cues and gestures and landscapes. Perhaps, I mean, I'm clearly biased, and I have a very vested interest in the word. And I actually got a Jung quote here, which I realized I had on me, so I'm gonna say it, because it sort of needs saying in some sense here. This is from his Madness and Creativity. And he says, the word is protective magic against the daemons of the unending, as if language is the guarantor of having limits. That's another way of saying it, perhaps, that we are, by using language, we're already in what we've been referring to as the father world. that is never going to render something perfectly. It can't. It's as soon as you put words to it, it's like it's distilled. It's come from an essence to a mental essence to a formalized, put into language, and therefore into space and time kind of. And then it's subject to how it's heard, which is another filtering, which again can distort it. And alongside that, there was we talked a little bit last week about Catafalque, the Peter Kingsley book, and someone that I work with at the moment is reading the book, and she sent me a quote that she particularly liked from it, which reminded me of reading that part of the book. So if anyone's following it, it's on page 117 of Catafalque, and I think also maybe relates to, interestingly, to what we've been speaking about today. And if I can actually see the words, Peter Kingsley writes there, we like to think it's we who are treading the path, progressing, being transformed, but that's not the case at all, because it's not our ego who walks the path. It's our higher self, the hidden divine reality inside us. It was never about us. It was always about the sacred and only about the divine.
Yeah.
Might not mean much if you're not in the context of the book, but I would recommend checking it out, because it's pretty clear. Counterspell again to some of what we have to. We're like gardeners here, aren't we? We're turning the soil over. We're doing a bit of weeding. We're planting a few seeds. We're doing a bit of watering. We're sitting back sometimes and looking and thinking that looks good. Then we're noticing something that's not right. We've got to act again. I'm a terrible gardener, I have to say, but this metaphysical gardening is more my thing than actual hands in the earth kind of gardening.
Yeah. I do share that. Yeah. Terraforming. I prefer my internal terraforming or transpersonal instead of just plugging into the soil.
Yeah. I had, coming towards an end, I had a poem that I was going to read at the end, which I would just say something about before we get to that point. So it's a satirical poem. I think that's the first thing I'd say about it. And it's translation. So it's a very recent translation, just done a few days ago, or a few weeks ago rather, of a poem written in 1970, I believe, originally in Russian, by the poet Joseph Brodsky, who was from St. Petersburg, Leningrad as it was when he was born there. I think he was born in 1940. Probably not a great time to be born in Leningrad, to be honest. But he left the Soviet Union in 1972, so in his early 30s, with the help of W.H. Auden, the great English poet, and ended up living and teaching in the States, died in 1996. And I think I had it written down somewhere. He was invited to leave or advised to get out of the Soviet Union because his work was described as pornographic and anti-Soviet, which is something of a badge of honor, I imagine. The reason that I wanted to read this poem is that it's kind of humorous and sarcastic in one way, but that it's about being locked down. It's about being confined. So I think what's going on in the poem is he's writing from the position of 1970s Soviet Union as someone who's basically a dissident. He's writing about the people of the 20s, 30s who didn't speak out against Stalin before Stalin became what Stalin became. And he's saying you didn't stand up, you didn't go outside, you didn't let your voices be heard, you stayed in your room. So the whole poem is about what is it like to stay in your room and what are the consequences of doing that, and why are you in there? Probably because of fear. And what is the real fear? I suppose it plays with those things. And the translation I've got here, which as I said is still kind of, the ink is still wet on, it's by a guy called Thomas de Waal, who I believe is related to Edmund de Waal, who wrote the book The Hare with the Amber Eyes, which is a superb book if anyone's looking for a bit of lockdown reading. Yeah, Edward Duvall's The Hare with the Amber Eyes, about the Japanese Netsuki in yeah, and then a whole kind of family constellation of history of these objects passing through, carrying all kinds of trauma and so forth. Well, this is, I don't know if that's his brother or perhaps his son or someone from the family, anyway, who clearly speaks Russian and has translated Joseph Brodsky's poem. So should I do that now? Is that?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to take my glasses off again for this. Yeah. Is it a little long? Well, you know, sort of half a dozen stanzas, but hopefully it'll flow along. So let me read it. It's called. It's just the first line is the title, and the first line is "Don't leave your room. Don't commit that fateful mistake." Here we go. Don't leave your room. Don't commit that fateful mistake. Why risk the sun? Just settle back at home and smoke. Outside is absurd, especially the whoop of joy. You've made it to the lavatory. Now head back straight away. Don't leave your room. Don't go and hail a taxi. Spend the only space that matters. In the corridor, its end is a ticking meter. She comes by, all ready for caressing, mouth open. Kick her straight out. Don't even start undressing. Don't leave your room. Just say you have the influenza. A wall and a table are the most fascinating agenda. Why leave this place? Tonight you will come home from town exactly as you were, only more beaten down. Don't leave your room. Go dance the bossa nova. Shoes without socks, your body bare and coat tossed over. The hallway holds its smells of ski wax and boiled cabbage. Writing even one letter more is excess baggage. Don't leave your room. Do you still look handsome? Just ask the room. Incognito ergo sum, as petulant substance once remarked to form. It's not exactly France outside. Don't leave your room. Don't be an idiot. You're not the others. You're an exclusion. Choreograph the furniture. Essay wallpaper fusion. Make that wardrobe a barricade. The fates require us to keep out cosmos, chronos, eros, race, and virus.
That's not sure. Probably from my end, coming from a different language background, that I couldn't feel the translated loss of meaning or structure or anything. It was really full blown poem of.
Yeah, I read a few translations of that poem, and some of them were terrible. I mean, probably technically very accurate, but they weren't really poems. They were like bits of failed carpentry that didn't quite come together.
Mm-hmm.
And this one, I'm sure, takes some liberties with the original text, but does so poetically. It risks the literal in order to achieve the leap of the poem. And I think that, it's an impossible conundrum to translate a poem, really. It can't be done. What you have to do is write a new poem that is, to go with our theme today, that it's like fathered by the original poem, you could say, but in a new language. So maybe that's what that pulls off. It certainly felt like the best of the ones. I read about 3 different translations, one done at the time, one done in the 90s, and this one done in March, I think very end of March of this year. Obviously with our current lockdown in mind, it's probably the guy had time on his hands and thought, oh, this poem's got virus in it, let's see if I can do a better version or a more contemporary version. But Brodsky won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think, in 1987. So I think he was in the early 90s. I think he was the American poet laureate, or whatever they call the equivalent in the States of the position of poet laureate, the eminent official poet who writes for state occasions and that kinds of things. I think he held that office until he died. So something else to check out if anyone wants to follow our leads.
This is a highly recommended thing. Brodsky is one of he's hidden compared to other Russian cultural things in general that we have our hands on these days. And he's somewhat in the shadows, and there's a very good reason for that. He's touching upon subjects that were and still are going sideways with a widespread desire to read something there. I'm sitting and I want to read that. And he's always betraying the purpose of that desire. People, you're reading something else. I do suppose this is why he's widespread, well-known. The Nobel Prize is something that gives you acknowledgement of that, but not really out there. So.
Yeah, I agree. How can you be a Nobel laureate and be hidden in plain sight? But he kind of is. Certainly to the English-speaking world, anyway. You know, I have been interested lifelong in poetry and of all cultures and things, and he's still relatively unknown to me, which, you know, probably says more about me than him, I'm sure. But it's not easy to encounter and hasn't been easy to encounter in English. Yeah.
Well, the language context really aids here, because, you know, Bulgarian and Russian have huge similarities around some technical, you know, architectures of the language.
Yeah.
And this is what connects the two domains.
Yeah.
Of present. And you can transfer things. I suppose Russian and English, there's a huge gap between that.
Yeah.
Easy to overcome, even with translation or with analysis.
Yes. And the way that, again, language constructs reality for us by and large, you know, so the language we have, it's that old adage about, you know, if that's our only tool, if it's a hammer, we see every problem as a nail. And, you know, I think generally speaking, English as a language, for all its upsides of being fairly transparent and there being a kind of easy thing exchange quality within it, it actually it feeds directly into what we spoke about today, about the sort of religion of inanimism. English turns nouns. It's all the problem with nouns, isn't it? we need verbs here. Yeah. And English struggles. It's not that it can't do it. It's in a habit of not doing it, let's say, or it's what it's found itself rewarded for at the level of like exploitation of resources and peoples throughout the world has reinforced and entrenched. It fails to leap a lot of the time as well. So, I mean, the classic example would be how in English you just have the one word for love that has to cover everything from how you feel about your dog to, you know, that spring morning to this one that is the beloved of your life, to your child, to your football team, to, you know, it's the same word for all of it, which you could argue, I guess, has a kind of unificatory quality to it, that it's all one love, as it were. But actually, it falls into that father wound. It has insufficient differentiation, put it that way. Whereas other languages, you know, have sublime capacity for differentiation of this kind of love, this kind of love, this kind of love. I was sent, not that it's about love, someone sent me a word, I believe it's a German word, but it was being used in probably a Scandinavian language, I think. I'd have to go back and check. And I'm not going to remember fully the definition, but the word was sonder, S-O-N-D-E-R. And the thing that was being evoked in this context was the moment where you realize that everyone you're walking past in the street has an inner life that is the equal in complexity and subtlety and screwed upness and sublime as your own. And it makes you kind of go, oh, because it's staggering and incomprehensible. I thought, yeah, that's what we need. We need words like that at a time like this.
Well, that might be a topic of, of conversation for some of the next times. Really,
I think that would be a lovely thing for us to expand into. And I guess between now and then, if I had a wish, I would wish us all the chance to, here's another word that's a little bit like sonder, to saunter, which is the English, kind of Middle English corruption of the French santerre, sainted or sacred earth. So if you saunter in English, you move across the land in a way that remembers that the land itself is alive and sacred, which is sort of what we've been pleading for in this conversation, really. So we all saunter along between now and when we next convene.
Yeah, even the French santé, with cheers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even that. Well, I have a thing. I'm aware of the time, but just something that really lands well with all the the fatherly, the father archetypal dynamic with all of us, and with Earth and with soul and many things. I was digging through a website which the specifics of the site are not that clear, but a big portion of it is engaged with Rudolf Steiner's work and their archives of a sort. I do believe that some of them are translated as we point, in a way that suits the purpose of this archive, but nevertheless, there are many valuable things. So I was reading through what is called in a website Lecture 1. There's no specific title, but it is discussing the emergence and the cultivation of spiritual science. Called spiritual science, and I suppose he is one of the fatherly figures of metaphysics, let's say. Madame Blavatsky is the mother, and so on. They have a constant dynamic, and even Roberto Saggioli, he had an alter ego of a sort, writing and researching into metaphysics. And so there's just one sentence that really suits the conversation, and in a very firm way, he's saying, quote, I have said repeatedly that the cultivation of spiritual science today is not the outcome of any arbitrary desire, but is a necessity of evolution at the present time. Unquote. I do believe that the same thing is very valid today in this specific situation, in this zoom of human history, regarding post-virus, virus, and pre-virus, periods. So the cultivation of this specific science is not just we're in some kind of emergency, let's jump to conclusions about this. It really is there all along, all the time.
Yes. Nice place to pause. Great. So let me just end this recording. See you all soon.